Welcome to Orange Wave, the series discussing progressive news, culture, and all things related to the NDP. I am your host, Will Adams. Now that there is a new season in both the real world and on this show, I'm going to clarify a few things about the immediate future. First off, episodes of Orange Wave are going to become more frequent. Season 1's latter end got slower because I was dealing with a bad breakup behind the scenes and I couldn't get myself out of bed to record episodes at all. But currently I'm doing a bit better, so I'm going to be committing to uploading more. Secondly, I tend to be active on social media. Your best bet is probably going to be any meta app, Facebook, Instagram, or Threads. I don't consistently use Twitter because I refuse to support Elon Musk in any meaningful way. I give a small tweet burst here or there on that platform, and then I'm done with it because of how vitriolic and far-right it has become. Twitter used to be a center-right platform, and Elon bought it and turned it into a far-right platform, and I don't really have respect for that. Instead of building his own platform, he decided to rob the work of someone else and burn it to the ground. I won't even call the platform X because of the fact that would be me supporting Elon Musk and his business endeavors. However, I still do branch out beyond meta apps, so if you are a conservative listener, you might be able to find me on Minds, Truth Social, and Getter. I'm also on Tribal if anyone here uses that. I make all the same posts across each platform, but your best chance for interaction is probably Instagram, Threads, or Truth Social. I also want to mention that in a previous episode, I shared my thoughts on this particular issue, and while my stance remains very much unchanged, if not stronger in the direction it already was, that episode, in a quality perspective, I believe it to have aged very poorly. I wanted to discuss the issue at large, but this podcast is a Canadian political podcast, and I had to wait for a matter that would allow me to discuss it. However, in retrospect, I probably should have sat on the issue until more information came out. And now that more information has come out and that it's become more of a broad issue, I figured it'd be great to bring it up again. So for those of you listening who might not have seen my previous episode on this subject, back in June, the Premier of New Brunswick was endorsing in this thing called Policy 731, and basically 731 was a policy change to schools that decided that trans youth under the age of 16 would have to get signed parental consent in order to be addressed by their correct name and or pronouns, and to be given the same rights as their identified gender. At this point in time, it was only New Brunswick doing this, and Pierre Poilievre had taken the, quote, provincial rights approach to this matter because I guess his advisors told him that it was, a bit too hot and that he needed to think it through. However, now there's been Saskatchewan, and even my home province of Ontario is now pushing this ultra-conservative nonsense. Here's a clip of Doug Ford throwing trans kids and teachers under the bus, likely to distract from his potentially career-ending Greenbelt scandal. So for those of you who haven't seen my episode on it, back in June, New Brunswick's Premier was pushing something called Policy 731, and this policy decided that trans youth under the age of 16 would have to get signed parental consent in order to be addressed by their correct name and or pronouns, or to be recognized as their identified gender in schools. At this point in time, it was only New Brunswick doing this, and Pierre Poilievre had taken the provincial rights approach to this matter because I guess his advisors told him that it was a bit too hot and that he needed to think it through. However, now there's Saskatchewan and even my home province of Ontario pushing for this ultra-right-wing nonsense. Here is a clip of Doug Ford throwing trans kids and teachers under the bus, likely to avoid the consequences of his potentially career-ending Greenbelt scandal.
Most important is the parents' rights. The parents' rights to listen and make sure they are informed when their children make a decision. They can't, it's not up to the teachers, it's not up to the school boards to indoctrinate our kids. I can't even figure out what school boards do nowadays, by the way.
This issue isn't just ending at provinces because Pierre Poilievre eventually gave a more clear answer on this subject back in August when he went to a mosque in Calgary for a Pakistani Independence Day celebration. In a video posted by Awaz Entertainment, an Urdu Hindi YouTube channel, Poilievre spoke about protecting freedom of religion and what he declared as parental rights.
I have a couple of questions for you. Question number one is that what do you think about the 1 million person march, and will you be backing it or part of it?
I don't know yet enough about it. I understand that it's parents who are frustrated with government imposing contrary values on their children. My view is that parents should be the final authority on the values and the lessons that are taught to children. I believe in parental rights, and parental rights come before the government's rights.
So if there was any doubt what Pierre Poilievre's opinion on the matter is, he just made his opinion crystal. He won't stand up for trans youth at all. And if this was where the story ended, then I don't even know if I would have made this episode. I probably would have just left it at the Fred's post I made back in August, and the first episode of Season 2 would have been the one about the Anthony Rota situation, which we will get to in the future. But no, this isn't where it ended, like, at all, as the Poilievre conservatives share this mindset too and beyond. September 7th came and went, and so did the 2023 Conservative Party Convention. The Conservative Party of Canada changed their logo, and let me just tell you that their logo, it brought a tear to my eyes. It looks fucking horrible. Like, I know that Aaron O'Toole's Conservatives, that their Conservative Party logo looked like they took inspiration from the Air Canada logo, but it, objectively speaking, looked nicer. The new logo for the Conservative Party just looks terrible. I hate it. But a logo change does not change your party's terrible character. During this said convention that I mentioned, having a new logo was not the only ridiculous thing they did. 69% of Conservative delegates voted in support of banning transgender youth from getting gender-affirming healthcare, because of course they did. Why wouldn't they do that? This comes from CBC. Conservative Party members may have voted clearly in favor of banning medical interventions for transgender youth, but party leader Pierre Poilievre still isn't saying whether he thinks the policy should become law. While visiting Nanaimo, British Columbia on Tuesday, Poilievre made his first public comments on the proposal since this past weekend's Conservative Party policy convention. He was asked specifically whether he supports the ban. Quote, "We just got a whole book of new policy proposals passed through the convention," Poilievre told reporters. "I'll be studying them carefully and talking with our caucus members on those policies. And when we've had a chance to do our homework, we'll have more to say." On Saturday, Conservative Party delegates in Quebec City voted 69% in favor of a policy that would prohibit anyone under age 18, quote, life-altering medical or surgical interventions to treat, quote, gender confusion and dysphoria. The policy proposal does not specifically use the term transgender and recommends offering alternative supports for, quote, gender dysphoria and related mental health challenges. It's not clear precisely which medical treatments would be targeted by the proposed ban. The Canadian Pediatric Society says that, for example, hormonal suppression through the use of hormone blockers is reversible. This is something that I feel strongly about, but before I even try and get into that, I believe there's one thing about this whole topic that is really important, and, you know, the right-wing establishment media and even some of the left-wing media networks, none of them are actually discussing this, so I'm going to do it here. Because it is unbelievably important. It's the question of just how willing are the Poilievre conservatives to die on this hill, and more importantly, just how likely is it that what they're proposing could even become law in the first place. So I do genuinely believe that the Conservatives are going to slowly lean into transphobia the way the GOP has done over the past few years, but from a law perspective, I personally do not believe that the Poilievre Conservatives are actually going to be able to get any laws restricting the rights of trans kids passed in the first place, if they were elected. Because if Poilievre is elected, it's very likely that he would get a minority government and not a majority government. Minority governments need other parties to support their policies to get them to be passed. And that's a problem for Pierre, seeing as Pierre has no good faith from the other parties. He has made enemies with not only the NDP, but the Bloc Québécois. You don't want the Bloc Québécois as your enemy. I say that because any controversial law or piece of legislation Pierre might try to pass under a minority government, whether it be relating to gender-affirming healthcare, abortion, the carbon tax, whatever the case may be, it's almost guaranteed to be struck down by the NDP and or the Bloc in an instant, which makes the CPC's proposed transphobic legislation very unlikely to pass. And assuming that just isn't a thing in the picture, it's still very unlikely to pass because the Poilievre Conservatives are being exceptionally ignorant with Canada's own laws. Banning trans youth from getting hormone blockers, gender-affirming healthcare, whatever the case may be, directly violates the Charter of Rights and Freedom, Canada's Constitution, what gives all Canadians the rights we currently have. The Charter is something that Pierre himself views as set in stone, at least with the context of vaccines. So with that being said, I'm going to read some sections of the Charter of Rights and Freedom and explain how what Pierre's Conservatives are proposing violates the Charter. Section 7, quote, everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person and the right not to be deprived thereof except in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. This section has long been interpreted to encompass the right to access necessary medical treatment or healthcare services in necessary circumstances. Gender-affirming healthcare is life-saving. It drastically increases life expectancy of young transgender people, which therefore would have it classified as a right to life thing. Something that it explicitly says the government is not allowed to deprive you of. Many forms of gender-affirming healthcare are used with other treatments for other things. Here's an example, some cancer treatments. That's something that is not related to gender dysphoria, and it still needs some form of gender-affirming care in there. Restricting trans youth and only trans youth from getting a form of life-saving healthcare directly violates that child's charter rights. And don't think for a second a trans child doesn't have charter rights. It says, and I quote, every single Canadian citizen. So as long as the kid in question has citizenship, they themselves have individual rights, including in this context. Section 15, quote, every individual is equal before and under the law and has the right to the equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination, and in particular, without discrimination based on race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, or mental or physical disability. This section can be relevant in ensuring that healthcare services are provided in an equal, non-discriminatory manner, and that individuals have equal access to all healthcare resources. I'd say that Section 15 also ties into what I said about Section 7 to a T, that it would be discrimination and thus a violation of our charter if Poilievre tried to pass a law like this. I think it's obvious that kid-related trans issues are going to become harder to keep out of Canadian political discourse due to the right-wing establishment media pushing lies onto parents and the general public. And I fucking hate that so much. If you're a policymaker or a parent who is pushing for policy to out trans kids to parents, you pretty much are just telling on yourself at that point. If you, as a parent, aren't an out-of-touch and bigoted jackass, you'll not only understand why outing trans youth to parents is a bad policy, but your kids would also tell you about that kind of stuff first. You would be the first person that they would come to if they knew or felt as though you were safe, because that is your job. You are the parent, that is your job. And there is a reason why I have such a big problem with this. If you mandate outing LGBT youth to parents, then you are statistically guaranteeing that a lot of youth will either be physically beaten, emotionally neglected, starved, homeless, or, even in worse cases, killed by their own families. This is a reality for trans and LGBT youth in general. According to an article by the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, 25 to 40% of homeless youth in Canada are part of the LGBT plus community, which would mean that 1 in 3 homeless young people in this country are a part of the LGBT plus community. That is not a small number by any stretch of the imagination. It's actually quite a big number. Most of these kids were kicked out because they have horrible parents, so it's not a hunch. It is a statistic and objective fact. I'm going to be blunt here and say that it is really fucking cruel to put youth potentially in dangerous situations because some Karen said that they want quote-unquote parental rights. I'm sorry, but quite frankly, I am really fucking tired of the radical right trying to spin outing trans kids to potentially abusive parents as a good thing and claiming it to be a right. Abusing trans kids is not a parental right. It'll never be a parental right. Pretending it is doesn't change that basic fact. If your kid is trans and hiding that from you, it's your own fucking fault because you're so out of touch that your own kids don't feel safe talking to you. Abusing trans kids, no, abusing any kid, whether it be physical or emotional, you don't get fucking parental rights after that. Parental rights end firmly where child protection and the child in question's charter rights begin. Full stop. That is not up for debate. Anyone with even a slight shred of fucking common sense will tell you that, because that is not something that should be debated. The fact that we in 2023 are even having this conversation at all, it is completely insulting to everyone. This is an issue I take personally because I know I am close with people who would be negatively affected in all sorts of ways if the Conservatives actually tried to pass legislation like this. I'll end it with this. Fence sitting on the Poilievre Conservatives is why this is happening in the first place. Personally, I specifically was able to sniff out his shitty character when I didn't even know anything about him, solely because he paid $50,000 to skip a leadership debate. I mean, I personally thought it was great to see that Pierre Poilievre supports democracy and open discussion, but, I hope those listening who could be affected or know people who could be affected by this kind of stuff, I hope that you might be able to have some peace of mind knowing that it is going to be unbelievably hard to pass those kinds of laws in Canada in the first place. And with that being said, thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Orange Wave podcast. As always, I am your host, Will Adams. If you want an issue discussed on the show, reach out to me on social media. This series is meant to be an informative podcast discussing political, economic, and social events in Canada and sometimes elsewhere to try and counter the lies of the right-wing establishment media. So thank you for riding the Orange Wave with me. I will catch you next time.